Here at Trinity Stamps, we are so excited to introduce to you the new card making sketchbook. This book is designed for you, the card maker, to be able to quick and easily capture your card ideas and your card inspiration. We have places for you to sketch out A2, A7, mini slimline cards, and even shape cards. Come back to your sketchbook whenever you need inspiration. I know you're going to love this sketchbook as much as we do.
Hello and welcome to the Stress-Free Card Making Summit. I'm Juliana Michaels, and I'm so excited to be a part of this summit and to share with you how to create this Christmas card with just 5 supplies. I'll also be sharing with you 6 different ways you can use Distress Oxide inks and how to heat emboss without ink. Now let's get on with the making. The 5 supplies you'll need to create along with me are a stamp set that includes both images and sentiments. I'm going to be using this set by Tim Holtz called Sketch Greenery. You'll need several colors of Distress Oxide ink. I'll be working with Uncharted Mariner, Rustic Wilderness, Pine Needles, Hickory Smoke, Evergreen Bough, and Walnut Stain. I'll also be working with superfine gold embossing powder, a stamping block, and a heat tool that is hot enough to use for heat embossing. The basic supplies you'll need from your stash is a piece of watercolor paper cut to 4 by 5 1/4 inches. I'll be working on the smooth side of the paper. You'll also need a piece of heavyweight white cardstock cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches for the card base, and another piece of heavyweight white cardstock for additional stamping and the sentiment. You're going to need a paper towel, a piece of printer paper folded in half, any type of adhesive you prefer, such as a tape runner, and some foam adhesive tape to add a little dimension. You'll also need a pair of detail scissors for some fussy cutting, a pair of tweezers, and a blending tool or brush for 2 colors of ink, a craft mat you can work on, and a small bowl of water. I'm going to begin with sharing one of my favorite Distress Oxide ink techniques called Stamp and Smudge. Distress Oxide inks are a combination of a water-reactive dye and a pigment ink, and this combination of properties allows you to use them in so many different ways. For this technique, I'm going to be using the smooth side of the watercolor paper, and I'll be stamping on it using a mix of the greenery images. Here I'm selecting 5 of the stamp images and which ink I want to stamp with each image. For this first image, I'm stamping with Uncharted Mariner Distress Oxide, and to apply the ink, I'm going to tap the pad onto the stamp and then stamp the image onto the paper. You can also tap the stamp onto the ink pad if you prefer. I'm going to stamp the image again here on the bottom right-hand corner, and now I'm going to stamp it on the other side. Each time I'm rotating the stamp to spread the images and color across the paper. Once I finish stamping all of the images with that color, I'm going to take the paper towel and lightly rub over the stamped image. Because the ink is still wet, it will smudge, and this is why the technique is called Stamp and Smudge. If while you're doing this technique you get some ink on your finger, like I did here, and it gets on the paper, don't worry about it. As you'll soon see, you'll never be able to tell it happened. Now I'm moving on to the second color and image. This time I'm stamping with the Pine Needles Distress Oxide ink. I usually find with smaller stamps that I prefer to tap the ink pad onto the stamp. However, with this technique, I often find myself tapping the stamp onto the ink pad to save a little time. Each time I stamp this image, I'm continuing to move around the paper to spread out the shapes and the colors. As I continue with the stamping, you'll see the pattern I'm creating come to life. After I've finished stamping these images, I take the paper towel and once again smudge the ink. So now I'm moving on to the third image, and I'm using Evergreen Bough Distress Oxide ink on this one. As I stamp each image, I continue to work at filling in the open spaces. And if you accidentally drop the stamping block and get some ink on the paper, again, don't freak your freak. You won't be able to see it once the background is completed, so just continue as if nothing happened. Once I've finished stamping that image in color, I again take the paper towel and lightly rub over the stamped images to smudge the ink. For this next image, I'm using Rustic Wilderness Distress Oxide, and as before, I'm going to stamp it in a way that fills in more of the open spaces. I then stamp it again to add some of this green color to the corners, which spreads the color across the paper. And yes, at this point, the smudged images might look a mess, but stay with me and continue to stamp and smudge. Here I'm quickly cleaning off my craft mat to do some additional stamping. I'm taking that extra piece of white heavyweight cardstock and I'm going to stamp this same image 2 more times with the Rustic Wilderness Distress Oxide ink pad. These images are going to become the embellishment for the card. This is one more way you can use the Distress Oxide ink. You can use it to create your own coordinating embellishments. After I stamp the image twice, I'm going to set this piece of paper to the side to give the ink time to dry, and I'll come back to it shortly. I then decide to stamp that image one more time on the background paper to fill in an opening I see. As I begin to stamp the fifth image with Hickory Smoke Distress Oxide ink, I realize that I forgot to smudge the images I just stamped. So I grab the paper towel and smudge the ink. As you can see, if you forget to smudge right away, no worries. Distress Oxides are a slower drying ink, so you have a little bit of time before the ink dries and you can't smudge it anymore. Now I'm going to finish stamping the fifth image, and for this one I'm using Hickory Smoke Distress Oxide ink. As I stamp this image, I'm going to really focus on filling in any of the open spots that are still left. I then take the paper towel and smudge the ink. Here's a look at the completed background I made using the stamp and smudge technique. As you continue to add the images and colors and smudge the ink, they begin to blend together to create a beautifully soft custom background. Next, I'm going to create the embellishments for the card. To do this, I'm going to do what is called fussy cutting, and I'll be doing this with the 2 images I stamped on that separate piece of paper. You want to make sure that the scissors you are using are sharp and have a pointy tip. When you start cutting, you want to cut off some of the excess paper around it, as this will make it easier to handle the paper while you're cutting. As I'm cutting here, I'm opening and closing the scissors, and I'm rotating the paper. The scissors don't move forward. They only move up and down as I rotate the image. By moving the paper, it makes it easier to cut any areas that are hard to reach. You also want to make sure that you are cutting with the bottom part of the blade and not the tips, so that you can get a nice clean cut. If you're not familiar with fussy cutting, it's when you use scissors or a craft knife to cut out an image or design from a piece of paper. This can be something you've stamped or drawn, or it can even be from a piece of patterned paper. It's an easy technique and you don't need any fancy tools to do it. All you need is a good pair of detail scissors and a little patience. I'll admit fussy cutting is not my favorite thing to do, but it's an easy way to create a custom embellishment to coordinate with your project like I'm doing here. Many people will do a bunch of this all at once while they sit and watch their favorite TV show. Fussy cutting definitely requires a little patience, but the more you practice it, the easier it will get. As I go to cut the second image, I cut off the excess paper and set this to the side. Later on, I'm going to stamp the sentiment on this piece of paper. One thing to keep in mind is that while you're cutting, you can always skip over an area that seems awkward and then go back to it after you've cut the main image out. Another thing that you can do is just take your time and if needed, go back and even out any uneven areas or places where you have a bump or just want to get a little closer to the edge of the image. Now that I've cut out both images, I'm going to use a foam blending tool to ink the edges. To do this, I rub the foam blending tool into the ink to pick up the ink and then rub the edge of the foam against the edge of the paper to apply the ink. I re-ink the blending tool as needed and work my way around the edge of the first fussy cut image. I then add more ink to the ink blending tool and repeat this process on the other image. Now I'm going back to the background paper I created. By now, the ink has had time to dry, and you definitely want the ink dry before you begin this next step. If you are concerned that the ink isn't dry, you can always run your heat tool over it for a few seconds just to make sure. Here I'm gathering my heat embossing supplies, which are the printer paper, the superfine gold embossing powder, the bowl of water, the tweezers, and the heat tool. Next, I'm going to dip my fingers into the bowl of water and then flick the water onto the paper. I then place the paper onto the printer paper, open the jar of embossing powder, and sprinkle it over the paper. I then pick up the paper and tap it to remove the excess embossing powder. And as you can see, the embossing powder sticks to the water droplets. I then move the excess powder out of the way and grab the paper with my tweezers. I recommend using tweezers so that you don't burn your hand as you apply the heat from the heat tool. The tweezers you're using should have rubber on the handle so that you don't burn your hand when you're holding them. I then turn on my heat tool and begin to apply the heat to the paper to melt the embossing powder. Because you're dealing with water, the heat tool will have to dry the water along with melting the powder. So be patient and give it all time to get hot enough for things to start happening. As you continue to apply the heat, make sure to keep the paper and heat tool moving so that you don't overheat and accidentally burn the powder or the paper. As I continue to apply the heat, the water begins to dry and the embossing powder melts. And as you can see, the powder changes from dull to a shiny gold finish. I personally find heat embossing to be so magical as I watch this transformation occur. And here is a look at the finished heat embossing. Now I'm going to get these supplies out of the way. I set the paper with the excess embossing powder to the side, but you can pick that up, fold it together, and use it to dump the powder back into the jar and reuse it. One last thing before I move on, I grabbed the bowl of water and I'm going to dip my fingers into the water and add some more droplets. Because Distress Oxide ink reacts with water, it will cause the ink to move and create a beautiful distressed look. I then turn the heat tool back on and use it to help dry the ink. You could also hold the paper with the tweezers during this step as well if your fingers are sensitive to heat. Because I'm moving the heat tool around so much, I'm not as concerned about burning my fingers during this step. Once you get the ink mostly dry, you can take your paper towel and dab any of the excess water dry. But unlike what I just did, make sure you give the paper a few seconds to cool off, or the paper towel might stick to the melted embossing powder. And here is what the background looks like at this point in the process. I love the distressed mixed media effect I've achieved with the combination of the Distress Oxide ink and the heat embossing. The final step for the background is to ink the edges with the Walnut Stain Distress Oxide ink. Here I'm using a foam blending tool to apply the ink. I'm rubbing the foam into the ink to pick up the ink and then rub the ink onto the edge of the background paper. As I apply the ink, I'm going to hold the blending tool at a slight angle so that one edge of it is coming into contact with the craft mat and the other is lifted and just touching the paper. I then work in a circular motion to pull the ink from the mat onto the paper. I continue this process of adding ink to the blending tool and then applying it to the paper. You'll notice that I use my left hand to hold the paper still as I apply the ink, and I use it to help rotate the paper as I move to ink the next side. Here I'm applying the Walnut Stain Oxide ink to the card base. And this is how these two pieces will layer together. Now I'm going to stamp the sentiment onto that extra piece of white cardstock I trimmed off earlier when I was fussy cutting. I'm going to stamp the Season's Greeting sentiment using Walnut Stain Distress Oxide ink. As I've already shared, oxide inks are slow to dry because they are a pigment-based ink, and this slower drying time means you can use it for heat embossing. So I'm going to ink up the stamp and then stamp the sentiment onto the paper. I'm then going to scoop up some of the gold embossing powder to cover the stamped sentiment, tap off the excess, and then as you can see, the embossing powder sticks to the stamped sentiment. I'm then going to use my tweezers to hold the paper, and I use my heat tool to melt the embossing powder and watch it transform to a shiny finish. I want the sentiment to stand out and be more noticeable on the card, so now I'm going to take one of the foam blending tools and apply Uncharted Mariner Distress Oxide ink to the paper. I'm basically creating my own coordinating colored cardstock. Once I get a good coverage, I'm going to take a slightly damp paper towel and gently wipe over the stamped sentiment just to wipe off any ink that might be covering up the gold embossing. So next I take my scissors and trim the sentiment into a strip, just trimming off the top, bottom, and sides of the paper while leaving a small border around the sentiment. I then use the blending tool to apply Uncharted Mariner Distress Oxide ink to the edges to cover up the white edge. So now it's time to assemble the card. Here I'm using a tape runner to apply adhesive to the back side of the background I created. I like to apply the adhesive just to one edge so that I can more easily line things up. I then flip it over to apply more adhesive to the back side. For the sentiment strip, I'm going to cut a piece of double-sided foam tape and trim it to size with my scissors. Now I'm going to take the fussy cut embellishments and apply a little adhesive to the ends. And put them together like this. I'm going to center them on the card here. Next, I'm going to add some foam adhesive to the back side of the embellishments to add some more dimension, but you could certainly skip this part if you would prefer a less bulky card for mailing. I then remove the liner from the foam tape and center the embellishment on the card front. For the final step, I remove the liner from the foam tape on the sentiment strip and then adhere it to the center of the card. Here's a look at the completed card and the 6 different ways I shared for how to use Distress Oxide inks. First was the stamp and smudge technique I used to create the background. I also added water to it to activate the ink and create a distressed effect. Then I used them to stamp and create some coordinating embellishments. Next, I used it to ink the edges of the background and the card base to create a vintage effect. Here, I used it to stamp and heat emboss the sentiment. And then finally, I showed you how you can use them to create your own custom colored cardstock. I hope you enjoyed learning how this card came together. One last thing before I finish. I know you are getting loads of inspiration and card ideas from this summit, but one can never have too much inspiration, right? That's why I put together a set of card sketches and inspiration based on some of my most popular Christmas card designs to help inspire you as you create your next Christmas card. To get yours for free, make sure to click the link on my speaker page. Thanks so much for joining me as I've shared my 6 Distress Oxide techniques in one Christmas card with you. If you'd like to keep in touch, I'd love for you to give me a follow on my social media outlets. Thanks so much for joining me as I've shared my 6 Distress Oxide techniques in one Christmas card with you. If you'd like to stay in touch, I'd love for you to give me a follow on my social media outlets. Until next time, keep crafting.